Um, I don't have a fancy PowerPoint for you. Well, I didn't before, but I don't even have one now. I'm going to talk about methodological naturalism. And maybe that term we should first get clear what it means before we talk about whether it's justified. In 1983, there's a Christian philosophy professor at Wheaton, conservative Christian liberal arts college. He advocated the practice of what's called methodological naturalism. And he said that whatever your metaphysical beliefs, whatever your beliefs about ultimate reality, you should never, ever posit anything but a natural cause for an event that takes place in the world. Now, this came to be known as methodological naturalism. It was also known as methodological atheism, provisional atheism, but those are all the same. It's come out, the term that's now routinely used is methodological naturalism. And there are many, many people that accept methodological naturalism, both people who are metaphysical naturalists, who are atheists, and there are many Christians who would accept it, many theists who would accept it. And the idea is that it allows people who have different worldviews to come together and be able to do science all together. And the idea is that it's metaphysically neutral. That is to say that all you're doing is adopting a certain method. You're not making any claims about reality. Now, something I'm going to argue is that that's an illusion. I don't think that what one thinks about the nature of reality can be neatly separated from the methods one uses to investigate it. And I'll say that again. What one thinks to be the nature of reality cannot be neatly separated from the methods one uses to investigate it. So, for example, if you think God exists, well, it seems at least conceivable that God might make his presence known. If, on the other hand, your metaphysical view is that God doesn't exist, it's inconceivable. So we should ask ourselves, can our method be divorced from what we think to be ultimately real? Now, a second reason I think to be suspicious of methodological naturalism is there is something that philosophers talk about, and it's called the demarcation problem. And that's technical jargon. What has happened is that we give science an incredible amount of authority. So much so that if something is termed unscientific, or even worse, pseudoscientific, then we think iffy whether we should accept it. If, on the other hand, it is deemed as scientific, then we see that as having a lot of authority. But when people began to question or ask the question, well, exactly what is science? They found that incredibly hard to answer. If you want a nice, neat distinction between science and non-science, actually, most philosophers would say that's impossible. You might say, well, what about scientists? Well, scientists aren't the really best people to ask here because they just go around doing science. They don't think too hard about what is it that makes science science. If I'm studying seals off the coast of Newfoundland, I'm interested in the seals more than I'm interested in distinguishing science from non-science. So it happens very often that when people raise this demarcation issue, they're raising it for what one philosopher called a weapon of war. So we don't typically ask, for example, whether engineering is a science. I know they did on the Big Bang Theory, like Sheldon would say that Horowitz wasn't a real scientist because he's just an engineer. But we don't raise that question of, is it really science? Except when we have a certain goal in mind. And very often that goal is discrediting. So, for example, many times, people talking about intelligent design, they're dismissed not on the basis of their arguments, but on the basis that what they're doing is not science. Now, really, that shouldn't worry us, because we should ask just, are they giving us good arguments? But scientific has come to mean reasonable, and unscientific has come to mean unreasonable. So, I think that if we're going to adopt methodological naturalism, and just to tell you my conclusion, so if you leave, you'll know, I don't think we should adopt it. But if we were to adopt it, we need to give some justification of why we adopt it. We need to have a reason why we adopt it. If we're going to say, this is a necessary condition of doing science, that we only give explanations in terms of natural causes, we need to be able to answer the question of, well, why would you accept such a claim? And I think what we're going to see, if I'm right in my argument, is there aren't any good reasons to adopt it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the usual justifications of methodological naturalism. And I'm going to go through going from the worst ones to the best one. Okay? So the worst one is that you insist that methodological naturalism should be adopted because the only people that don't want it adopted are creationists. Now, that's an illustration, or that's an example of what is known as the ad hominem argument. And ad hominem is simply Latin for against the man, or if we're to be less sexist, against the person. Whatever a person's motivations are, that should be treated separately from the merits of their argument. So, for example, Richard Dawkins has argued that evolution is great because it allows you to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, Dawkins is delighted with that. He wants atheism to be true. Does that mean that I can dismiss his argument? No. The fact that he wants atheism to be true is not really a good reason for me saying, well, automatically he cannot have good reasons for being an atheist. Similarly, if I want theism to be true, that doesn't mean I couldn't have a good argument for it, in fact, being true. So it will not do simply to dismiss critics of something on the basis that they have a certain bias. Okay? So that's the first justification. Doesn't really work. The second. Well, the second claim, second attempt at justification, is that science in principle excludes any recognition of the supernatural. So you have Robert Pennock, a great critic of intelligent design. He insists that methodological naturalism is a scientific ground rule. And quoting here, as a point of method, science does not countenance appeals to the supernatural. So on that view, methodological naturalism is a necessary condition of doing science. Now, there are at least two reasons, I think, to reject Pennock's claim. First, notice that Pennock is simply asserting that. If you ask, well, why must science exclude recognition of the supernatural? He doesn't give us a reason. He simply stipulated this is what science is. So if one wants to claim that science prohibits ever talking about a non-natural cause, one should provide some reasons for that. And second, although methodological naturalism may work well in some areas of science, it's far from clear it works well in other areas of science. I mentioned this earlier today in my other talk. We can distinguish between nomenological science and historical science. When we explain things in terms of laws, we generally look and can find natural causes. It's much less clear that that should be a stipulation when we're looking at historical events such as the origin of life, or life just doesn't arise routinely. Okay, a third justification, and this one again goes back to Robert Pennock. And he objects to methodological naturalism. He says, well, if you don't presuppose naturalism, then you're simply stuck with a chaotic universe. So quoting here from him, he writes, well, God, if we let God into the picture, God might simply zap anything into or out of existence. In any situation, any pattern or lack of pattern of data is compatible with the general hypothesis of a supernatural agent unconstrained by natural law. He goes on to say, you can't live simultaneously in a world of natural causation and of miracles, for if one miracle can occur, there is no limit. And at every instant, all physical regularities may be ruptured and a totally unforeseeable set of events may occur. This seems to be kind of a nose of the camel argument. You let God poke his nose into the tent and pretty soon the whole camel's going to be in the tent and nothing's going to work. Well, again, 2 points. There seems quite a confusion in suggesting that how you choose a certain methodology determines whether in fact the universe is chaotic. Whether or not the universe is chaotic, it's going to be chaotic or ordered independently of the methodology we choose. It isn't our methodology that creates an ordered universe. Okay. And along these lines, and this goes back to our first talk Friday night, here's a nice quote from a Christian philosopher at Calvin College, Del Ratch. He notes, science works only in a very particular sort of reality and only with a very particular sort of conception of reality. The requisite picture of a comprehensible, intelligible, uniform, predictable, even beautiful cosmos which can in principle make sense to finite minds like ours when observed via perceptual faculties is a picture of a cosmos structured like a creation. Although details are disputed, that Christian doctrines of creation and of divine voluntarism, that is to say God's freedom, provided a hospitable home for science. Those roots of science, they're not in dispute. Science developed in a Christian context. So at least historically, it's very clear that belief in the reality of supernatural causation did not hinder the development of science. So when Pennock says, well, look, if you're prepared to admit miracle or supernatural intervention, if you're prepared to admit that, then you simply couldn't study nature. Well, it'd be interesting if you went back and read the works of Robert Boyle, the father of chemistry. Boyle was a hugely influential scientist. Boyle was also extremely interested in miracle. He didn't feel that recognizing divine agency in nature precluded being able to study nature. Second, this idea that if you admit supernatural agency, then anything goes, that, God may go around zapping things. What God wills although God is free, what God wills is going to be in accord with God's nature. Okay? So when we talk about God doing things, we're talking about God doing things, and we understand that God has a certain nature. That nature is not going to be just something that wants arbitrary and chaotic conditions in the world. So here's a nice quote from Evan Fales, who is actually an atheist. He comments, "It does not follow from the fact that God is a free agent that his purposes and behavior, including the occasional performance of a miracle, cannot be made intelligible or studied in systematic ways." Here might be an analogy. I can study how the motor works in my car. Whether or not that motor was zapped into existence 10 minutes ago, or whether an intelligent agent, a human intelligent agent, built it, I can study how the motor works. Okay? So when we come to talk of interventions, generally we're not talking about how nature works, but rather about the origins of things in nature. And third, along this, replying to this objection that God could simply zap, we have criteria for recognizing events which are best understood as agency. Now, a fourth attempt at justification, and our friend Pennock again raises it. He seems to have a whole slew of these worries. But sometimes people say, well, look, if you allow for the possibility of supernatural causation, that's a science stopper. And the idea here is that if we were to say, for example, that God created the first cell, well, presumably, according to this objection, then everybody's going to get lazy. And they're going to abandon the search for natural causes. So even if the search for natural causes could have been successful, we won't find it because we just said God did it. Well, in looking at that objection, we've already noted that the belief in supernatural agency did not hinder scientific development. Okay, so there were lots of people who took supernatural causation seriously, and yet were very prominent, influential scientists. Second, if you propose a supernatural explanation, that doesn't mean that you can't have competing explanatory hypotheses. So, I believe in the resurrection, and I believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, I haven't met many hardcore atheists that say, okay, he rose from the dead, but we're going to give a natural explanation. I just haven't met very many. But if a hardcore atheist wants to say that to me, I'm going to say, you have my blessing. Go look for a natural explanation and tell me when you've got one. And by the way, as we know more and more science, it gets harder and harder for you to give me that explanation. Okay? So accepting divine intervention, that doesn't mean that the conversation gets closed off. You can have naturalists doing all the scientific work they want, attempting to explain, say, the origin of life in natural causes. But why rule out the people who want to take the hypothesis of design seriously? And if, in fact, you have this methodological naturalism, if, as a matter of method, you are saying it's never appropriate to posit a non-natural cause or supernatural cause, notice what your method has committed you to. Just suppose, for instance, that God did create the first cell. If you're a methodological naturalist, you can't ever recognize that. And what that will mean is that no matter how implausible the explanation you come up with in terms of natural causes, no matter how implausible, how improbable that explanation is, you will be committed to some such explanation. So accepting methodological naturalism guarantees that if supernatural causes exist, they can never be recognized. Imagine that you were at the raising of Lazarus. Okay? And Jesus says, it's going to be okay. And he calls out, Lazarus, come forth, and out comes Lazarus. Well, suppose you are a believing Christian scientist, but you've accepted methodological naturalism. As a scientist, what are you going to have to say? Better get looking for those natural causes. As a Christian, you go into religious mode now, what are you going to say? I think God did it. It would seem to me that that would mean that you have to be pretty schizophrenic. Wouldn't it be better if we had a science that wasn't stopping us from recognizing what seemed to be non-natural causes? And it doesn't mean, by the way, that if you accept an event as a miracle, if later there does come a good explanation in terms of natural causes, you could say, well, I was mistaken. Better not say it too quick, though, because we want to know how good the natural explanation is. Now, a fifth attempt at justification is that methodological naturalism is sometimes defended on explicitly theological grounds. And I mentioned these earlier today. These generally take the form of assertions that the perfection of God implies that his purposes in the world must be accomplished exclusively, perhaps in the case of more conservatively minded, an exception being made for salvation history, by means of secondary created causes. So you will have people, probably the name Howard Van Til doesn't mean much to you, but you have people following Van Til who assert, well, nature is fully gifted, and any supernatural intervention by God in creation would be coercive and inconsistent with God's perfect love. So sometimes you'll have people saying, well, if God makes something happen in the universe, then he's being mean to the universe. He's coercing it. If I hang a picture on the wall, am I coercing the wall? Maybe the wall was designed to have a picture hung on it. God acting in the universe, to say that that's coercion, assumes that God shouldn't act in the universe. And again, we want to know, well, what's the justification of a person saying God shouldn't act in the universe? I should also point out there that if you're making that theological move, that justification is inconsistent with the claim that methodological naturalism is metaphysically neutral. Because what you're saying is this is the way God has to act. God has to act only instrumentally through secondary causes. And of course, that's much more than a method. That's a claim about how God has to conduct himself. Now, I come now to the justification that I think has the most force to it. And it's the claim that methodological naturalism is inductively justified. Now, induction is just a fancy word for us talking about how we reason from particulars to the general. We find that something has been successful in previous instances, and we say, well, we should keep on doing it. So, interestingly enough, people who have been writing around this issue have increasingly tended to defend it on the basis I'm going to talk about. And when I say these people have increasingly defended it, I mean both Christians who advocate methodological naturalism, or theists who advocate it, and secular metaphysical naturalists who advocate methodological naturalism. And that is, they say, well, people doing science have been very, very successful in finding natural causes for events. So we should just keep up with that practice. So rather than making methodological naturalism, rather than saying this is what science is by definition, or saying that this is an essential element of science, they've said, no, that's too strong, but we should nevertheless be methodological naturalists because look at the success that this method has given us. So, quoting here, there are no clear a priori reasons to exclude the supernatural from science. Rather, it is an empirically validated methodology and should be honored unless and until a better framework comes to the fore. Okay? Or, along the same lines, it can be accepted as a provisionary and empirically grounded attitude of scientists, which is justified in virtue of the consistent success of naturalistic explanation and the lack of success of supernatural explanations. Now, I've suggested that this is the best shot, but I don't think it's very convincing. It's interesting, that last quote I read to you, it's actually from people very, very critical of intelligent design. And if you read the article, what you find is they say, well, look, these previous justifications of methodological naturalism, they don't work. But don't worry, we're not opening the door to intelligent design. It's strange how many people, after they say something that seems to fit very well with taking intelligent design seriously, will then reassure you, but don't worry, we're not in that camp. Now, I don't think this attempted justification is very promising. First, we might take it more seriously if methodological naturalism were really held very tentatively. But let me read to you a quote that's often used from Richard Lewontin. He writes, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the world. But on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence of material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, and listen here, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." So, far from being a tentative saying, well, you know, maybe here you could check this method, but of course we're open to it, finding out it doesn't work in this instance, methodological naturalism tends to function as an absolute prohibition on ever considering any hypothesis other than natural causes. Second, I want to go back to the distinction I drew between nomenological science and historical science. As I mentioned, methodological naturalism, we have been very successful in finding natural causes for regular occurrences in nature. It's the occurrences that are far from regular. We don't see life routinely arising that we would want to maybe consider invoking supernatural agency. And given that's true, and I gave you the analogy of pigeons and foxes, well, I could go with turtles and cheetahs this time, but you've got the idea. The fact that you can catch turtles easily, the fact that you can give explanations in terms of natural causes, in a certain class of events, does not mean that you have strong support for saying that you will have success in positing those causes in a different class of events. And if you look at it, any inductive argument regarding cosmological and biological origins, those seem to be on the side of the design inferences. As we've seen in our talks, we have strong evidence for the universe having a beginning. So a little over a century ago, it was possible to view the universe as eternal, and the structure of living cells was relatively simple. This is no longer so. The more we know, the harder it is to avoid positing design regarding origins. So our best cosmology points to a finely tuned universe coming into existence without any natural cause. Similarly, although structures that manifest redundant order, and by that I mean order that's simply implicit in the thing itself, something like a crystal, those are easily found in nature, but none of those exhibit the specified complexity, that is to say, the information that exists in DNA, RNA, and proteins. Such structures stubbornly resist any explanation in terms of natural causes. Further, we have scientific disciplines where design inferences are routinely made. Archaeologists, for example, are willing to identify primitive tools precisely on the basis that what they are looking at bears the type of structure we know to be produced by intelligence. It's been closed down now, but the SETI project, which was searching for extraterrestrial life, it was looking for life on the basis of whether or not there'd be signals from space that exhibit a pattern requiring intelligence. Now, I find that very interesting. It seems that we are okay with using design as a scientific explanation so long as we can put that design to attribute it to, say, human agents. It's only when the design would have to be attributed to a non-natural agent, and if you say, well, who might that be? The list gets pretty short. Okay? So appeals to design, they appear to be accepted as long as we have this naturalistic story of how intelligence could be explained, human intelligence could be explained by non-intelligent causes. Presumably the theory of evolution does this. But note, the question of whether an object is designed, that is to say, is the product of intelligent agency, is distinct from the question of the designer. Okay? Those are two different questions. Okay? So, recognizing design, we then can ask the further question, what is the identity of the designer? Okay? But if we can recognize design, then we should recognize design just as design. Now, if in looking at the second question we say, well, we know we couldn't have done it, that's not a reason to say we couldn't have recognized design in the first place. Let me give you a thought experiment. Suppose one goes to a faraway planet and find symbols on a cliff face that turn out upon inspection, this is my teeny weeny bit of math, okay? You've had lots more math, so don't get frightened. And you find on a cliff face the symbols, and when you interpret the symbols demonstrate the impossibility of trisecting the angle and doubling the cube. Now, those of you who know some math, I don't know why that's so important, but I looked it up and put it in as an example. You're not going to have any hesitation in identifying that mathematical proof as a result of intelligence. Okay? Now, you don't have any idea as to the identity of the agent responsible. And let's extend the thought experiment. You do a search of the whole universe. Okay? You don't find any physically embodied designer. Are you still sure that you recognize the design? Seems to me we are. Even in human terms, like, well, I have my glasses off, so the exit sign tends to look pretty blurry, but I have no doubt that an exit sign was designed. What color hair did the designer have? I don't know. I don't know whether he had any hair at all, or she had hair. How tall was the designer? I don't know. Did the designer have a body? Well, I assume so. But if it turns out that the designer didn't, I still recognize that as designed. So the question of whether life is designed is independent of the question of who did the designer. Now, it's true, the recognition of design leads very quickly to the second question. But it's important that you realize they're two different questions. And it's noteworthy that the people in the intelligent design movement have said, well, what we're really looking at is, can we recognize design? And they've been very careful to say, well, it's a further question then to ask, does that designer look like? So it won't do to reject instances of design on the basis that if they're recognized as genuine, they constitute evidence for supernatural designing intelligence. It won't do to say, well, we'll recognize design as long as it can be human design. Design is design. And whether the design was by humans, by aliens, or by God, that's a different question. So, my conclusion. Well, I've argued that methodological naturalism, contrary to its proponents' claims, is not metaphysically neutral. And I've argued that its acceptance as a practice requires justification. And I've also argued that attempts to justify it are failures. It can't be defended as a definition or as a self-imposed limitation of doing science, nor, even more modestly, as an inductively justified commitment to natural causes. Now, its rejection in no way prohibits scientists from searching for natural causes of physical phenomena. The issue is not whether it's legitimate to look for natural causes, but rather whether science must or should in all circumstances confine itself to attempted explanations in terms of natural causes, no matter how inadequate such attempted explanations prove. Whether in science or other endeavors, you need to be free to go where the evidence leads. If the best explanation for some events or structures is direct supernatural agency, then science needs to be able to have access to it. And any methodology which precludes such access acts not to further scientific investigation, but rather to place science in an explanatory straitjacket. Now, I'm going to conclude by telling you a little story of what happened to me at a conference one time. I was at a conference on methodological naturalism at Oxford, and at the end of the conference, they had all the big names up on stage. And I raised the question. I said, well, look, if you were present at the raising of Lazarus, such that Jesus says, come on out, and out comes Lazarus, should you, prima facie, should your first explanation be a natural one? Or should it be a supernatural one? And I could not get the speakers to answer the question. What they did was they said, well, how do we know that Lazarus actually came out? How do we know that Lazarus was alive? How do we know this is not Randy the magician doing it? Well, that wasn't the question. The question was, if that event happened, is it more rational to think of it as having a natural cause or supernatural cause? And it seems to me that there are situations where it's more natural, and that's prima facie, that's just at first glance. But at first glance, it's more rational to assume you have an explanation in terms of agency than an explanation in terms of non-intelligent causes. So there are situations where prima facie we should look for natural causes, but it seems to me there are other situations where the marks of agency are so evident that our first inclination and our areas of investigation would be in terms of agency. And with that, I conclude.